Welcome, everyone. My name is Jack Fortin, and I'm the curator and facilitator for this virtual Winter Centered Life series. Glad that you all are able to be with us during this winter time. And we just have a few housekeeping things to let you in on as we begin this series. I just want to remind you of some of the logistic details. Today's meeting will be recorded as it will be posted on the Augsburg YouTube channel at a later date. And we'll try to keep you informed as those emerge. We do have a live captioner today, so please click the CC button at the bottom of your screen to enable this transcript from taking place. And lastly, we will have time after we hear from our speaker today. There will be opportunities for Q&A, but there's also an opportunity during the time for you to go to the chat room and submit your questions, and we'll try to bring those to our attention during the course of the presentation. I think that's all the housekeeping things that we need to know about as we begin this series. What I want to do now is introduce the theme, kind of the impetus behind this theme for this series, and also, of course, introduce our speaker for today. The theme is our historical heritage, interrogating our sagas as we seek to live faithfully in the time being. The impetus for this came as some of us were reflecting on the current situation of this prolonged pandemic crisis and looking at how both individuals, communities, and institutions are tending to look for short-term relevant fixes instead of looking at our roots for guidance. And in some ways, people were making up their future based on the immediacy of the crisis. And this is not unusual. Historically, people have often taken shortcut routes and trying to find quick fixes in times of crisis. One of the things that happened along the way is looking at Dietrich Bonhoeffer and his work during the time of the Nazi regime. One of the things that he discovered was that the church tended to try to be clever in responding to Hitler and not look at their own historical roots. And so instead of being clever, they became complicit with what was going on there. And it was Dietrich Bonhoeffer that said, knowing our history is critical to the sustainment of our future, both personally, family-wise, and institutionally wise. And Paul Ribino, our speaker, refers to this in his introduction, if you go on our line to see it. It was Pope John Paul II who said that to understand our history isn't enough. He said we need to live our history. And he said the term for that, he said, was tradition. And he said he defined tradition as the active function of remembering to pass on. The active function of remembering to pass on. That it's not just seeing our history, but it's understanding and living our history. An example of active function of remembering to pass on would be what taking the sacrament is, where we actively remember and participate in the word and sacrament as a way of passing on that remembrance so that it becomes live, a living remembrance. And it's really behind looking at that need to do that. And we had two things kind of coincided. It was our awareness of that, and also the fact that our own Augsburg University was looking at its own historical heritage, looking at the stories behind what created and shaped Augsburg's capacity to be an urban center, an urban educational center. And so that work converged with this need, has put together this 4-part series, which we hope will both be stimulating from its own historical sense of Augsburg University, but also be your own impetus to rekindle your own core understandings of your historical heritage, both from a family and from an institutional perspective. To do this and to kick it all off, we have the great privilege to hear from our president of Augsburg University, Dr. Paul Primenow. So, Paul, welcome. And just to kind of, before you get into your formal presentation, you play such a unique role. I mean, you've been an educator, you're obviously a leader, and you have a real deep sense of history and its importance. But maybe you could just share with us kind of how that happened with you and why that's become a part and parcel, really, of your leadership at Augsburg University.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Jack. It's great to be with you. Yeah, I can probably tie my interest in history back actually to my undergraduate days. I was a sociology and political science major, so had that kind of focus there, but actually was a history minor, and always had that fascination with at Luther in the late 1970s. And that was really around some of those Norwegian roots. And I remember reading Giants in the Earth, and lots of those trying to understand that history and really embrace it as part of certainly the identity of that institution. When I went to graduate school then at the University of Chicago, I always say that it wasn't good enough to be a sociologist. I needed to be able to take a stand on something, so I became a social ethicist. And but at the same time, always was fascinated in how the issues that we were facing always had a heritage that needed to be faced, both for the sake of how that would help inform the work in a positive way, but also perhaps places where, in fact, that history needed to be faced with the kind of critical eye. And so I ended up, as many folks know, I spent a lot of time studying the settlement house movement in the late 19th and early 20th century, and that became a fundamental part of my own kind of perspective as a social ethicist. And what I learned from Jane Addams and her colleagues at Hull House in Chicago was really informed my work. And so as I then stepped into leadership, both at Rockford University, where I was before I came to Augsburg, and here, that what I was concerned about was that, in fact, both institutions perhaps weren't spending enough time thinking about how that history and the threads of that history actually had informed who we had become. And in particular at Augsburg, where we have become this remarkably diverse community of students and faculty, trying to understand why is that the case. This is not some severing off from that history, but from my perspective, it is actually it's a thread that runs through our history that in fact helps us to think. And that's what the project that I'm going to describe here today is really about. And I feel it's my work as president to help guide that conversation so that those who come after us understand that this is part of a seamless whole that we happen to have in our historical narrative. So that maybe that's enough on that. My own kind of personal journey here, but it's been a fun project.
Yeah, well, we really look forward to hearing from you and from the critical participants with you in this research project that you've been doing to uncover that history and to look at Augsburg's, I like the word Augsburg Saga as an urban settlement. So we look forward to this theme of yours for this February 2nd opening, Vocation and Location, Augsburg Saga as an urban settlement. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Jack. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here so that we can, I believe that should bring up the PowerPoint. Yeah, very good. Well, again, thanks all of you for joining us. I see lots of good friends on the call here, and much of this may be familiar to you, but maybe it gives you a sense of how those of us at Augsburg are thinking about, again, kind of embracing our history. And what you're going to be experiencing over the next 4 weeks here is actually you're coming alongside a small group of faculty, staff, and students who were formed about almost exactly a year ago as what I call a community of learning, community of practice and learning, to actually spend time together interrogating our institutional saga. And so you will hear next week from a member of our faculty in the education department and one of our assistant provosts on some of their work. You'll hear again from me and Dr. David Teedy in a couple weeks on specifically on our Lutheran free church tradition and what that means for our work today. And then in our final session, you'll hear from a faculty member and a doctoral student on specifically our work in the neighborhood. And those are themes that we've actually touched on. We meet monthly as a group, and we're actually now transitioning into a place where we're going to start writing this down. So we're going to actually publish a book at the end of this project. It's a project that's been funded by the Lilly Endowment. So it's been a great joy to be part of that group. And we've learned a lot about Augsburg and about each other. And I think that we're going to really provide an important map, if you will, to Augsburg's future. So you're looking at this opening screen, and for those of us who know Augsburg, this is actually a scene from our students who go on the river semester. So this is something that Augsburg does that's certainly a very signature part of who we are, our commitment to experiential education. And the students go out and spend an entire semester going from St. Paul all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. And I think that commitment to what happens in the classroom, to what happens in the world is actually such a distinctive part of the education that Augsburg has provided for many, many years. And so it's always fun to be able to share. Let me tell you, I will sometimes go down and meet these students on the river, and their resilience and courage and just willingness to take risks, it's quite remarkable to be with them and to hear their experiences that they have on the river. So let me talk a little bit about this idea, and I want to frame it up by just reminding you, I think you saw in the introduction to this session, I love this little passage from W.H. Auden's For the Time Being. It's a wonderful epiphany story. We're in the Christian season of Epiphany, of course, and let me read it here quickly just to remind you that, so that is that. Now we must dismantle the tree, putting the decorations back into their cardboard boxes. Some have gotten broken, and carrying them up to the attic. To those who have seen the child, however dimly, however incredulously, the time being is, in a sense, the most trying time of all. For the innocent children who whispered so excitedly outside the locked door where they knew the presence to be, grew up when it was opened. In the meantime, there are bills to be paid, machines to keep in repair, irregular verbs to learn, the time being to redeem from insignificance. I think for those of us who are part of the Christian faith tradition, we know, that kind of moment of, the Christmas celebrations and everything goes with it, and then you get back to life. And I think that, one of the challenges, as Jack referenced, getting back to life is sometimes we only think about the moment, as opposed to the notion that, all these mundane pieces fit together, and part of our job is to help make sense of them. And in many ways, this whole Saga project that I've had the privilege to be involved in is helping to make sense of Augsburg today in its mundane everyday life, which is something that we all, many people in this call have experienced, certainly as students or as faculty members or as alums, and it certainly is important for me to think about how we keep this task in front of us. So let me just say a quick word about the idea behind this interrogation of the saga. So here is a picture on this slide of Burton Clark, who was a professor at Yale. And he wrote a very important piece back in the early 70s, you see it referenced there, about the concept of organizational saga in higher education. And his argument was that not every institution has a saga. It's not your linear history, it's not just your mission, it's not just some historical narrative. It's actually threads, if you will, that come together to both welcome people into the community. That is the initiation, kind of connecting you into the community, and then it's actually the fulfillment of that promise that's in that initiation, and how those threads then come together to provide what he describes. And this is the most important thing for me: how does your saga bind your community together at the moment? How does your saga bind the community together? So as we've been reflecting on Augsburg's history with this group, we are looking for those threads that can help us make sense of what we've become, which is something very different in terms of student body population, demographic, in terms of the kind of neighborhood we live in, the kind of demands of the world. But how is there still in those threads of that saga that binds us together as a community. And ultimately, it's an open question. I mean, to be quite honest, I happen to believe that Augsburg has a saga, but we've faced it as an open question. Really, is there a saga here that ties this current Augsburg community together? And I can tell you, halfway through the project, I believe there is. But it's important for us to understand that that's where the concept comes from. So when I think about why we interrogate a saga, I have really three component parts that we've been looking at. On one hand, it is to educate each other about that history, to remember, to take our history and bring it back together, and to do that through the lens of appreciative inquiry. So when you look back in Augsburg's history, there are these just wonderful moments and wonderful individuals that I want to claim, and I want to lift them up, and you're going to hear about a few of those over the next several weeks that really have fundamentally shifted kind of Augsburg, made Augsburg what it is today. But at the same time, along that education kind of component of interrogating a saga, there's also the notion of being accountable. Because the truth is, there are aspects of our history, threads in that history, where in fact we didn't live up to our promise, to our highest values. And so can we engage that saga then through a lens of truth and reconciliation? Can we tell the truth about where Augsburg did not live up to its commitments? And if you were to go back, for example, and this is one of the places we spent some time, to the late 1960s, and some of you, again, alums might remember this notion of this one day in May, which was a gathering shortly after Dr. King was assassinated, where the community came together to try to challenge itself on trying to live up to its commitment, especially to its Black students' experiences. And the fact is, when we celebrated that night, one day in May, a couple, 3 years ago, at the kind of 50th anniversary of it, we had to face the fact that there were claims made in that moment that in fact did not get lived out. There were promises made that did not get lived out. And so we face that, when we say that out loud and we say that truth to each other, so the fact that we can reconcile, if you will, with that history. And then ultimately, for me, again, the notion of a saga sets a path forward. So it becomes this intentional claiming of that history for the sake of finding that saga that binds us together as we go, on our way here in the 21st century. So that's the kind of basic concept behind this. And basically today, what I want to do is just share a little bit about some of my thinking about Augsburg as sort of a case study of this notion of interrogating the saga. And a lot of these things your people on this call are going to know, but of course, just understanding that, our founding back in 1869, our move to Minneapolis in 1872, and then how, in many ways, the little village that was Minneapolis at the point that Augsburg came to this now grew up as a city around the seminary, the college, of course now the university, even as Augsburg stayed in its place, in its location. And I think that every day as I look out the windows of my office at the Murphy Square Park and recognize, how different our neighborhood is around us than it was in 1872 or 1875 or 1900. And yet here we are, Augsburg, still in this place. And what does that mean about who we are and how we live our life every day? So one thing, we have a picture here of the beautiful lobby of the Hague First Center. And I'm especially pleased to be able to see the scriptural notation there, John 1:14 on the wall, the word became flesh and lived among us. And many of you know that same scriptural passage is on the wall outside our chapel, outside the Haverston Chapel. It's in Norwegian, a reminder of our Norwegian heritage, but it's important for us to understand both, again, the theological claim that puts upon us as a Lutheran Christian institution, but also the practical claim that I think that provides to us in terms of what it means to be the Word made flesh in the context of our day-to-day life. And as I've had the privilege now to serve Augsburg almost 16 years, I've really come to see four distinctions that I lift up that are really linked to our place. And that is, first of all, our Lutheran faith tradition. I go all the way back to Hans Nielsen Hauge, this, late 18th, early 19th century Norwegian lay preacher who also happened to be a kind of remarkable business person and, built businesses and cared deeply about local economies, and yet also preached the gospel and didn't see those two things as separate. They were actually connected. And so our faith tradition really positions us to imagine the callings of all of our students, no matter what disciplines they're in. They don't all have to go off and be clergy. They, in fact, can live out those callings in a variety of ways, and that's really a gift of our tradition. I also focus the distinction of our academic mission, what I mentioned earlier when talking about the river semester, our deep commitment to the connection to experiential education that has really become a part of everything Augsburg does. The importance of the classroom, of course, but also connecting what happens in the classroom to experiences that students have out in the world. Our specific urban location, and in particular in the neighborhood that we have the privilege to be a part of, the Cedar Riverside neighborhood, but also to think back in that history to understand how, when the freeway was built, I-94, perhaps some of you were in school when that happened, or you think about how the trench going into the University of Minnesota and how that neighborhood was actually quite cut off, deliberately cut off from the rest of the city. And what does it mean to be a neighborhood that was cut off, and how do we reconnect to the rest of the city? And then finally, what I think is for me, has just been one of the real joys of my time at Augsburg is to really sense that the institution truly believes that it has a public calling, that is actually called both to educate students for lives of meaning and purpose, to do what remarkable things they will do, but also to be an institution that stands for the kind of values that have really defined who we are. And that work takes lots of different forms, but it takes, in particular, standing alongside of our neighbors and the challenges they have, and being institutions that care, or an institution that cares deeply about their well-being alongside of our institution. So those four distinctions really shape, in many ways, what I think this connection between vocation and location means. These, in fact, define our vocation as an institution, if you will. So let me then I want to touch on this notion of place. And I want to be very clear that I have a very expansive notion of place. It both means geography. So yes, the 20-some acres that we happen to be living on in the middle of Cedar Riverside, the connection to the oldest city park in Minneapolis, Murphy Square, to the hospital and across the road, the University of Minnesota. That geography is important. But when I think about place, I also think about networks of people and of commitments and of causes and the kind of the broader kind of environment that we are part of. And so it's important for us to think expansively about what I mean by location and by place. And I think that what this leads us to is really that a deep call that we have as an institution to be neighbor, to think about how we share this place, this kind of focus on mutuality, and how then that actually becomes a strategic priority. In fact, it's embedded in our strategic plan to focus on this important connection between vocation and location. So let me talk a little bit about this saga. I have a picture here, actually a fascinating picture, that's a historical picture that is of a group of Augsburg community members, probably back in the late 1920s or early 1930s, standing in front of Old Main, a building that still, of course, stands proudly, with a sign that says, "This entire block for sale. Inquire at office." Think about that. They were selling the campus that we're a part of now. And this is, some of you know this story. As the college seminary had grown up in the neighborhood, things around the neighborhood weren't always as pleasant as they wanted to be. There was a lot of vice going on. There were saloons and dance halls kind of nearby, and they were concerned about crime. And so those folks that were leaders of Augsburg and the Lutheran Free Church said, boy, we need to go someplace safer. And so they actually were looking at buying property in Richfield. If you go to Richfield, Minnesota today, you can still find Augsburg Park, which was the land that Augsburg intended to build a new campus as well as a broader residential community on. And so, if you care about our current location, you might think, well, what was going on then at that moment that led them to think about this? Well, there were reasons why they made this tradition. And then, of course, I always like to say that we were saved by the Depression because all of the pledges to buy that land sort of, they went away because of people's loss of their assets. And so, in fact, Augsburg wasn't able to make that move. I think I can say that if we had made that move, we might not be here talking about Augsburg today, because I think in some ways just becoming a generic kind of suburban, campus wouldn't necessarily have allowed us to kind of come back to what really sets Augsburg apart as a college and a university. So we take seriously the fact, again, that there was this effort to move away from that commitment to location. But at the same time, then, to think about how did we get back, even with this falling apart. It wasn't good enough that this just happened to fall apart, that the pledges went away. We had to think about how we got to back to a more positive way of thinking about what it means to be in this place, to be in the city. And here we then turn to a remarkable individual, and I have pictures here on this screen of a man named Joel Torstenson, whom, again, folks on this call may well know Joel. There are pictures both of he in a classroom and then later in life. I had the great privilege when I first arrived at Augsburg in 2006 for those first couple of years to get to know Joel. And so it was really a gift to be able to know him. And I have another picture here that shows our students involved in working with some of the neighborhood kids, which that's the legacy that Joel put in place. So Joel in the 1960s, here he was a kid from North Dakota who came to Augsburg as a student, then went off and got a degree in sociology and came back to his alma mater to teach. And he was teaching in the 50s and early 60s. And in 1966, 67, he took a sabbatical, which took him around the country to visit various urban campuses. And when he came back to Augsburg in 1967, he prepared what is now just a famous paper that he read to his faculty colleagues that said, it is not good enough for us simply to be in the city. We have to be of and with the city. And that moment, 1967, I can tie back from that moment forward, Augsburg on a whole variety of fronts, transforming curriculum, co-curriculum, thinking about relationships to the neighborhood. All of that got shaped by that changing perspective on the work of being of university or college in the midst of the city, being of and with the city. And as many of you know, Joel helped to certainly to strengthen the sociology department, but also the creation of a social work department, of a Metro Urban Studies program. He helped to found outreach programs like something called the Crisis Colony that many of you know about, which was an opportunity in North Minneapolis to take students to live alongside of neighbors there, and then of course the work that was going on around our campus. And really, if you look over the 50-some years from when Joel wrote that paper, we have just constant gifts of faculty that come to us around those commitments and really then take it to another level. So you think about people like Gary Hesser, who I know is on this call, or you think about people like Nancy Fisher today, or folks in our social work department who've really picked up the thread of Joel's commitment and made it real, and continue to make it real every day in how we live out this commitment to being of and with the city. So just the notion that I always point to this, apart from this particular theme, to say, think about the difference one faculty member can make for the life of an institution in the way that Joel Torstenson did for Augsburg. As an aside, I will tell you that a member of our Board of Regents, a fine alum, Mark Johnson, has actually established the Joel Torstenson Chair in sociology, and Tim Pippert, a current member of the sociology faculty, has that chair. And Tim and I and another colleague from the nursing department are actually currently working on a book about Joel Torstenson's legacy. And it's going to be both kind of an overview of what he did. It'll actually reprint some of his own work. And then it's going to actually trace that work through 50 years to understand what it looks like today that we can tie back to Joel's remarkable legacy. So very proud of being able to celebrate that work at Augsburg. So as Jack said earlier, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the ways that I then think about this work, this vocation-location intersection going forward. So first going to talk a little bit about the notion of Augsburg as an urban settlement. I want to talk a little bit about, again, what place-based work looks like, which is really about the work we do alongside of our neighbors in our place. And then Another concept that I'm just going to lift up is this notion of our work as an anchor institution and the specific ways in which that plays a role in carrying on this commitment to vocation and location. So here we have pictures of various, I'm sorry, I'm going back and describing the pictures because of our commitment to accessibility. I know some of you can see them, but some others may not. But here are pictures of our students collecting goods for our neighbors. The Soup for You Cafe, which is located at the old Bethany Lutheran Church across the freeway. There's a picture of our community garden. And then some of our students involved with the McGeezy organization, which was a Native Indigenous organization that actually was affected deeply by the racial riots that happened back in the summer of 20, and we have continued to be involved with them and support their good work. So I'm proud to be able to share some of these pictures of our work going on in the neighborhood. So let me just start with this notion of Augsburg as an urban settlement. Again, the settlement house movement, for those of you who might know it, was very active in Minneapolis. So the Pillsbury House down on South Chicago was a former settlement house and still a settlement house, I guess. The Brian Coyle Center in the Cedar Riverside neighborhood is actually a part of the Pillsbury United Communities. You might know the Phyllis Wheatley Center that was up in the north side. These were all versions of the settlement house, that movement that really started in the United States in the 1880s, 1890s. It was came out of a British experience, a place called Toynbee Hall in London. Jane Addams went there and visited and brought the idea back, and then it quickly spread to other cities, from Chicago to New York to St. Louis and really across the country. And these were houses, actually facilities that were located in neighborhoods and often were populated by young college graduates who wanted to be neighbor. And the idea was to come and live alongside of neighbors and work to help make the neighborhood safer, healthier, whatever it might be, not with a kind of expert, perspective, not like I'm going to come in and fix your problems, but much more with I will be your neighbor. We'll do this together. Again, that sense of mutuality. And so for some 40 some years, Jane Addams lived at Hull House in the west side of Chicago before she died in 1935. And then, of course, the settlement house movement sort of went away for a while, just because as the social services systems got built up at the kind of governmental level, the need for these local agencies wasn't as strong. But then they've actually come back, I would say, in many ways. We're now seeing the kind of resurgence of interest in what the settlement house movement meant, about a way of being present in a neighborhood. And for me, as I think about Augsburg and what we're doing, a big part of, you think about it, we have settled into our neighborhood. I mean, been in that particular location now for 150 years. So we didn't go in and say, we need to leave because it's dangerous. We went in and we said, we need to stay because we need to make this neighborhood better, safer, more compassionate. And that continues to be the work. So I go back to what I said earlier about John 1:14. We have this kind of institutional vocation statement. We believe we are called to serve our neighbor. And we think about, in fact, from a kind of an academic perspective, how this commitment to settling into a neighborhood creates an expansive classroom for our students. And so you can just imagine that if you are a student at Augsburg and you're in the neighborhood, Cedar Riverside neighborhood, you're going to run into people from a whole variety of different backgrounds, ethnic backgrounds, folks from Somalia, folks from Ethiopia, folks from Korea, Vietnam. Just think about how that broadens your horizon on what you're learning about, because different life experiences than your own, and so it just really becomes a classroom, if you will, from my perspective, for democratic engagement. So that's an important kind of overall framework for thinking about this connection between vocation and location, what it means to be an urban settlement. I then also think about how this work begins to mature. So one of the things here, pictures that I've got here are of different programs we run. You see that vocational statement there above the doors in our chapel, and you also see just various programs that we run. Some of the students involved in our urban debate program, a member of our nursing faculty who runs the Health Commons, our really great fortune of having the Forum on Workplace Inclusion, now a part of Augsburg, which is an organization that really provides wonderful training and the like for corporate folks that work in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space. So all of these programs in some ways become part of a portfolio of commitments that live out our commitment to how that intersection of vocation and location. They become ways that we tell a story, if you will, to the world through our actions about our commitment to the public purposes of higher education. And I just couldn't be more proud about the fact that that these programs, they come up organically. Our faculty, our staff, from people that come and become part of our community, bring these programs to us because they see Augsburg as a place that, in fact, creates space and has a real commitment to this work as a part of its broader mission. And so, when I always say that we don't have to create things out of whole cloth, because people have these ideas and they bring them to us, and they become, in some ways, all aspects of that commitment that we have, a version of that commitment, living it out in different settings and with different audiences. Let me just say a little bit about some of the specific areas that I'm particular. This is a picture of our work in interfaith efforts. This has become one of our, probably our most fast-growing area of expertise. Part of it is linked to the fact that as our student body has become more diverse, as it has now over the past 12 to 15 years, we have students on our campus who represent all the world traditions, as well as the humanist traditions in the faith commitments. And so we had a kind of automatic opportunity then to engage them with each other in learning the skills of interfaith living, if you will. And so this work then takes lots of different forms. Here we have a picture of our Interfaith Fellows, which is a student group that now every year we have a group of Interfaith Fellows who work together as a course, but they also then share their learning with the rest of the community. We bring in speakers like Rahul Gill, who was the Sikh leader and was out at the California Lutheran University and gave a talk that talks specifically about his perspective. You may know that we have a Muslim chaplain in our campus ministry office now, serving our Muslim students. And so it's become an important part of who we are on campus. It's now becoming very much a focus for what we do in the world as well. So we take the lessons that we learn about interfaith and we take them out into the world, to corporate settings, to other nonprofits, and we share with them the lessons we've learned that we believe are important to their life as well. So it's a way that, again, we take our academic mission, our core work on campus, and make it available to the wider world. Also, very much kind of committed to thinking about how particular needs around in a community, in a neighborhood, actually help to define programming. So there's this kind of synergy that happens when you recognize a need in the community. How do you then lean into that need in a way that then starts to lead to a whole variety of efforts? So food is certainly an area where we've seen that in our neighborhood. The food insecurity in our neighborhood is a real challenge. And so you have pictures on this page of our community garden, of farmers markets, of students working on our campus kitchen program. These are all ways that our commitment to food has now become part of our ministry, if you will, in the wider neighborhood. So we have the student-led campus kitchen program, which actually takes leftover food from the cafeteria and other sources and actually prepares meals that are then taken out every week, in fact, to shelters, to senior citizens, to community centers, to kids. We also have, as we've shown pictures here earlier, of our community garden, which is nestled in the arms of the Hagfors Center, our new building on campus. And so that community garden now provides garden patches for many neighbors who come to campus in the summer and grow their own food and take it back, and so have opportunities to learn how to be gardeners and to care about nutrition. We've been working with lots of local producers on how to think about how we meet the nutritional needs of our community. This became a very important aspect of our work now over the past couple of years in the pandemic, because the food insecurity that was there before was only exacerbated by the pandemic. And so we've now become recipients of pretty significant grant support from both the city as well as foundations to be able to step into this work. And it was all because we had these relationships, because we had these programs in place that now allow us to step in and be even more effective in meeting the needs of our neighbors. I also always like to lift up some of the other specific ways that we're involved. Here we have pictures of some high school students who are part of our Urban Scrubs Camp, which is a summer program that we run where high school students come and learn about health professions on campus. And it's a great chance for them to to hear from experts, doctors, nurses, others, social workers, others that are involved in the health world about a career path that they might have. So, and in particular, a focus on some of the local high school students from our neighborhood and how we can help them to think about that path to college. We work closely with the community colleges in the Twin Cities and trying to create a seamless transition from the community colleges to Augsburg. And then I've mentioned earlier this notion of an anchor partnership, and that what that means is that we collaborate with other colleges and universities as well as healthcare institutions in the Twin Cities on how we can actually help to enhance local economies, how we can create more workforce opportunities, how we can be involved in placemaking, if you will, thinking about, again, how a neighborhood, the way it looks, the way it feels, how accessible it is, those are all part of how a neighborhood creates a more healthy and just kind of dynamic in its life. And so the Anchor Partnership was founded really about 13 or 14 years ago, and it's just been a really an important vehicle for us to come alongside of our neighbors and, again, not to impose ideas on or fixes on them, but actually to be their partner and leveraging whatever way we can, assets or resources or influence for the sake of helping to meet the needs of our neighbors. This is an example. The City Riverside Partnership is actually the name of the Anchor Partnership, and here's some pictures of some of our neighbors, the kids in particular that are involved with us in some of our youth programming. Excited to think about all of them becoming Augsburg students at some point, which many of them are doing at this point. I mentioned this earlier, but we are home for the Minnesota Urban Debate League, another example of where we felt that working with a group of attorneys here in the Twin Cities that had founded this organization, mainly because they saw debate programs being taken out of high schools. And they said, well, debate was very important to my going to college and going on to law school. So they said, we need to get debate back into these high schools. So they started as a volunteer organization. And I don't know, about 7 or 8 years ago, came to Augsburg and asked if they could become part of our institution, which they did. And they now run programs in Spanish, in Somali language. They run them in middle schools and in high schools. And ironically, much of this, their work is actually funded through the school districts that at one point had taken these programs out of their budgets. So a great opportunity for us to create a pipeline of students, especially from the cities, into higher education. And whether they come to Augsburg or go to other places, it's still creating that sense of confidence, that sense of those abilities, those critical thinking skills that then allow them to imagine going on into their next steps in their educational journey. Another area where we focused again around this commitment to, in particular, closing the achievement and opportunity gaps for people of color in the Twin Cities in Minnesota is the creation of the East African Teachers Program. It's called the EAST program. It's funded primarily through the state government, but it's really around creating cadres of East African teachers who can go into the public schools. And again, trying to think about how do we put teachers in classrooms where the students say, there's someone who looks like me. And we know that there's a real gap in the teaching population in Minnesota of teachers of color. And so this has been an effort that led by faculty member Audrey Lensmeyer, who's pictured here, along with some of the participants in this program. So very pleased in that effort. We also have a wonderful opportunity just across the street. I have a picture here of 2200 Riverside Avenue, which is, for those of you who know Augsburg's address, it's directly across the street from our Hubbardston Chapel. It's a little corner. It used to be Smiley's. It's now the Sisterhood Boutique. And this was a business enterprise that was founded by a group of high school girls from the neighborhood, mostly Somali girls, who wanted to be able to give back to their mothers. So they came back with this idea, and our MBA students actually helped them write a business plan, which led to their getting some capital investment. And they now run this thrift shop right across the street from Augsburg. And they get all kinds of donations, and then they open up and they learn the skills of fashion design and merchandising and the like, so that they then can have that kind of under their belt before they go on to, again, if they come to Augsburg or go to another institution, they carry those experiences with them and give them that kind of leg up on being able to be socially mobile, which is a big part of what we try to do for our students. So that gave you kind of a quick, very broad kind of overview of the ways we live out this connection between vocation and location, what it means to be in the place where we are, connected to the networks of people that we're connected to for the sake of responding to their needs and our needs. So when I think about this work, this Saga work, I also want to just point to where we're headed next with this work, and it's work that's going on campus. And it really is around our commitment to equity and inclusion. And on this page, you have pictures of our very diverse student body at a graduation ceremony, involved in various campus activities, showing off some of the awards that they've won. And what I really have faced in my now 16 years at Augsburg is the fact that many of our traditions, our faith tradition, our academic mission in the liberal arts, our Norwegian heritage, in many ways carry with it experiences of white people. I mean, I just don't think there's any question about that. I think we all recognize that. So the question is, again, bringing both an appreciative inquiry to that as well as a candor and a kind of critical eye. How do we think about where, in fact, that experience of being white people involved in this work actually perhaps blinds us to or leads us not to be able to see the places where obstacles are put in place of our students and their success. And so, especially with the profile of our student body and our immigrant neighbors, we think this is really critical work. And so I'm very proud of how our community has responded to this. And one of the ways we are coming to this work is to take Augsburg's deep commitment, a motto that they actually established back in the 100th anniversary of 1968, through truth to freedom, and now to expand it to say through truth to freedom by way of reconciliation. That is, we need to name the truth and understand, like we do in the Saga work, where in fact we lived up to that truth and where we did not, for the sake of actually then saying there are places that we have to find reconciliation. We have to come back together. And the pictures here give you some sense of how our students and the rest of us are leaning into that. There's a wonderful picture in our chapel of our celebration of One Day in May back in 2020, where there's the banner says, "Justice long delayed is justice denied," quoting Dr. King. There's pictures, of course, of our students involved in the protests after George Floyd's murder. Pictures of I'm there at a press conference at the state capitol supporting our students who are undocumented students. And then also I'm pictured there delivering meals to those experiencing homelessness in downtown. And all of those, these are ways that our community is leaning into this work of finding truth to freedom by way of reconciliation and setting that table where all the voices are heard as we imagine how this saga unfolds and binds us together into Augsburg's future. So I think that is the conclusion of my formal remarks, and I am very happy then to take the screen sharing off and respond to any questions or hear stories from you about your experience in thinking about Augsburg's place and what it means for our life together. So thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Paul. I think, as you know, it's a lot to take in. I mean, all the things that are going on. It's the challenge is, how do we collectively, as part of this community, how do we embrace, even within the Augsburg community, all that's happening? I think it's not easy to communicate it out, right? Because there's so many different aspects happening at the same time. How do you address that challenge?
But that's why I think thinking about a narrative framework that helps to make sense of it. I don't expect everybody to know everything we do. People choose where to be involved. I mean, students, they're in campus kitchen. That's great. That's their way of living it out. And it seems to be leadership responsibility is, in fact, to provide a framework for helping people to understand why we would be involved. So as they learn about the Urban Debate League, or they learn about the Sisterhood Boutique, or they learn about the anchor work, so for me, personally, the notion of Augsburg as an urban settlement actually provides that narrative framework. That is the way that we define a commitment to place, our commitment to mutuality, our commitment to justice, and that fits within that framework. So that whatever form it takes, I may be the only one that actually at one point actually talks about all these specific things, because I'm the only one that knows about all of them, which is fine. But I think the key is to, in fact, provide a cohesive narrative that actually helps people to understand why these pieces fit. And the truth is, why they actually are also an extension of our academic mission. I mean, that's the key. I mean, what we are doing in a lot of these efforts is both equipping students with the skills to live as engaged citizens when whatever they choose to do in the rest of their life, but we're also modeling for them a way of being citizen, of what it means to be, committed to neighbor. And so our hope is that no matter where they end up, living in a neighborhood, being part of a faith community, whatever the case is, they will have watched Augsburg's work and say, I see, that was about, that's why you do that. I mean, that's why you, should care about these issues. And in particular in our world today, I think that becomes a even more critical set of skills, if you will, and perspectives for our students to carry out into the world, where people are so divided, and we want them to say, the division isn't the be all and end all. You've got to get in there and lean into the work and find ways to do the work together. And I think in particular, I think about a lot of the work we do brings together students from a variety of different backgrounds to do the work, and they find commonality in the actual work that they're doing together out in the neighborhood.
I see Augsburg as an institution having to face the diversity that all of us as individuals are having to face in today's world. And I'm sure there'd be some fairly traditional Lutherans out there that are saying, now, with all this interfaith stuff going on, how do we retain our identity in Christ and still minister to Muslims and others? And I think there's some clues when we think about the difference between relativism and pluralism.
Yep.
Or where do we find our own center in being able to also embrace others? Could you speak to that? Because I think we all struggle with how do we hold on to our own tradition, our own heritage, and reach out to people very different than ourselves.
Yeah. Well, for me, most of the folks in this call know me. I mean, I'm a cradle Lutheran, product of Lutheran higher education myself, and and am the only person at Augsburg who has to be a Lutheran. Come to find out, that's what the bylaws say. So I came to this work when I first arrived, worried that Augsburg was taking for granted its Lutheran heritage, and so given my experience prior to Augsburg, mainly in non-sectarian institutions, I really believed that we needed to get back to doing a deeper dive into that Lutheran heritage for the sake of, again, trying to describe why we do other kinds of work. And so much of my time at Augsburg has been about saying, what does this Lutheran heritage mean for us? Why does it matter? We teach all of our students, in 2 required courses, the concept of vocation, the theological concept of vocation, so that they can make sense of their life in a way that is a gift of our tradition. Why do I focus on service to neighbor? Why do we care about our particular kind of perspective on what it means to know and to be known? All of those theological concepts that I probably am not going to go out and explain in great depth theologically to a student, but I'm going to show him or her this is why this Lutheran heritage matters to the kind of institution we've become today. And I think that there are people who tell me that they think at this point Augsburg may be more Lutheran than it's been in lots of years, but also at the same time we all know it's much more diverse than it's ever been. And so for me, the interfaith work is an example actually of saying that Lutherans care deeply about the links between faith, learning, and service. So why wouldn't we want to share that commitment with students from different faith traditions, not for the sake necessarily of converting them to be Lutherans, but actually to help them to make that same connection within? So I just listened, just an example, I listened to a beautiful chapel talk this week. It was a conversation between our university pastor, Babette Chapman, and our Muslim chaplain, Fardosa Hassan, about the story of Hagar and Ishmael, and the common way that they could sit together and talk about how the Quran looks at that story and how the Bible looks at that story, and find in that the intersections that actually tie our religions, traditions together, even with the places that they go in different directions. I mean, it just was a powerful moment for me to see that that's what we're trying to do here. And we couldn't do that if we didn't go deep into our own tradition and take responsibility for it, to say we have to be accountable to how that Lutheran Christian tradition has shaped us and continues to shape us, so that we can actually engage the other in a way that is fully embraces the whole project. So it's really been for me exciting to watch. And the truth is, we're getting national and international recognition for the fact that we're making a commitment to that work, because we know more and more that organizational settings are going to be places where people of different faith and other value traditions come together to work. And if they don't know how to navigate that, that's going to make our workplaces less, productive and effective. And so we're getting a lot of calls now to go out and do training in local companies about workplace, skills, interface skills in the workplace. And so it's just an interesting way, again, that the lessons we've learned become part of a broader narrative that we can share with the wider world. So.
Well, if I was inspired to look at my own heritage to try to find some clues, what suggestions might you make? I mean, you just referred very quickly in your introduction about using appreciative inquiry, which I think is a wonderful process that I think anybody could actually tend to. But could you just speak to that a little bit? Because maybe there's some people that are listening to theirs says, wow, I come out of a Norwegian heritage, or I come out of a German heritage. I've never really thought about how that heritage has shaped me. How do I go about getting at that?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I think that in particular, one of the things that we've learned in our equity and inclusion work is that those of us who are white often don't go back and look in a very in-depth way at trying to understand that cultural heritage and what it can mean for us. And I mean, there are gifts I happen to have both Norwegian and German kind of background in my, so what can I go back and find in that? And what's the lens that I can bring to understanding? When I go back now and rewrite or reread Giants in the Earth, for example, which when I read it as an 18-year-old, I don't think I fully get, but to go back now and understand that what these folks were seeking as they came to this country, the way they carved out a life, the kind of courage and resilience that they brought to this work so that they could make a better life for themselves. Well, I mean, the truth is that's exactly what I'm trying to do for our Somali and Ethiopian and African-American students now. I'm trying to help them make a better life, to carve out, especially for the immigrants, to carve out an immigrant experience that allows them to become more socially mobile. I mean, it seems to me that's always been the goal of higher education, to help create better social mobility. So people did it for me. So how are we going to do it for students today? And so the lessons that we learn from our own heritage, through that lens of inquiry, and also through the lens sometimes of places where we didn't live up to that. I mean, that's why I always want to keep that balance and that tension, if you will, which I think is a creative tension, to be able to look at that heritage. Because if I look at our students today, and as folks know on this call, I mean, our students at this point, we are a majority minority institution in terms of our makeup of our student body. And when I talk to our African American students, our African immigrant students, our Latinx students, Asian students, they tell stories of their own heritage and their own life experience that is now they're bringing to bear in their education. So I sometimes with our white kids, I don't think we do that, so we need to, and I think what can happen in the classroom then when you've got kids from different backgrounds together, students of different backgrounds together, is they actually learn important lessons about what they might want to do. So I have heard stories, for example, of our religion classes where the Muslim students who are taking the course on vocation and learning about it are actually sharing their own kind of understanding of their own faith tradition. And the kids from more traditional Christian backgrounds are kind of looking around like, oh, I guess I've never thought about that. I've never thought about this beyond confirmation, and so they're being challenged to say, okay, how did my upbringing as a Lutheran or Presbyterian or Episcopalian, does it make any difference to how I do this work? And so I think that's the hope, is that in that kind of interaction, that synergy that you get from folks from different backgrounds, you really get a chance to challenge each other to think about how we can strengthen our own kind of understanding of our background culture.
Well, thank you. Mark Center, Reverend Dr. Mark Center, asks the question, how do you fund urban students' tuitions?
Yeah. So Minnesota is a great state for private higher education because the state of Minnesota has a state grant program that is, its qualifications for it are tied to the federal Pell Grant. So for a student from Minnesota who has a particular financial need, they come to us with $5,000 or $6,000 from the federal government, alongside of another $5,000 or $6,000 from the state government, and together that gives them a real leg up. Then, so when we add to that our own institutional resources or scholarships that they bring with them, or the work that they're going to do in order to do it, we can actually make it affordable to students. And that's in particular case because there's a large number of our students, I think somewhere now between 50 and 60% of our students are Pell eligible students. So they're actually students who come to us with access to that Pell Grant from the federal government. And so I would just tell you that I spend a huge amount of my time lobbying in both St. Paul and in DC for those programs, because they are the fundamental way that we actually make an Augsburg education accessible. And the beauty of the state grant program or the Pell Grant is it goes with you. It's student choice. I mean, these are not Augsburg programs. If a student wants to use the state grant to go to the University of Minnesota, they can do that, or to go to Mankato, or to come to our private. And that's really the power of the state grant program. Is it really is it's students going where they believe they can be most successful. And in Minnesota, folks may not know this, but of 17 private institutions that are part of the Minnesota Private College Council, we educate a good third of the students in the state of Minnesota when you add the aggregate number. We actually also have even higher percentages of our students who go on, for example, something like 40% of the graduate students at the University of Minnesota are graduates of our private institutions. So we actually also provide feeders. We're feeders to the public universities. So a lot of that, and I'll give you one little data point on that state grant program. We have evidence that $1 investment on the part of the state in the state grant program returns $4.30 to the state in terms of tax revenue and other forms of revenue. So in terms of a return on investment, it's one of the best investments, and we continue to feel like the state legislature for the most part really get that. So that kind of one way of thinking about how we make college affordable for urban students. So
yeah, that's great. George Dahlman recalls the story about how the Minneapolis Park Board refused to sell Murphy Square to the Department of Transportation, or recall maybe you even telling the story. Yeah. Could you expound a little bit on that and how that's going to fit into our capacity to stay where we are?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because, folks may know that Murphy Square is the oldest city park in Minneapolis. When the freeway was being designed, they had various paths that it could take. We know what happened in Rondo, where it basically cut the community in half. And when they were coming close to Augsburg, I think there could very likely have been the case, and I don't know exactly the facts, but I think there's probably some chance that a more straight route might have been pretty much right through Murphy Square Park, and and as a result of that, through basically the primary block in which we're located. So the park board ended up giving up about, I think when I've looked at pictures, it's about a quarter to a third of the park was lost to the freeway, but the rest of it was held on to. So what we now have is maybe 65 to 75% of what was the original park. But it's really interesting. One of the facts that become part of our conversation about reconnecting the Seward neighborhood across the freeway with Cedar Riverside, one of our arguments for a land bridge or something that would be a better connector between Cedar Riverside, going over the freeway, is that in fact Murphy Square is still listed as the park for the Seward neighborhood. So think about that. Right now, if you are a resident of Seward, living off of Franklin or nearby, this is supposed to be your park. Well, the only way you get there is to go over a very scary, pedestrian bridge over the freeway. So we are using that now as some leverage to try to, as they are doing in Rondo, trying to reconnect these two neighborhoods that were historically, connected. So,
yeah. Well, thank you so much, Paul. I was wondering, as we close here, if you could say a few words about next week's very interesting thing on Who Writes Our Histories with Professor Terry Kwame Ross and with Katie Bishop as well. Both very interesting people on our campus.
Yeah, Professor Kwame Ross is a member of our education department and has a particular interest in working with young Black men. He's got some really interesting research that he's done there. But in this project, what he focused on is going back and looking at many of the places where somebody was the first to do something at Augsburg. And he actually even goes beyond Augsburg's history, goes all the way back to Martin Luther. Actually, it was very interesting when he made his presentation. I assume this will be part of what he does, and talks about Martin Luther being the first to, challenge the Catholic Church and what that led to, and then he ties that to people who have done who were the first women at Augsburg, who were the first Black students at Augsburg, and what that means. He looks at that kind of philosophically, what it means to do that, and what are the challenges to being the first. And then what Katie does is almost a kind of a case study of that. Is she looks specifically at the role of a woman named Gerda Mortensen, who people on this call will probably some of will recall was the first dean of women at Augsburg, starting in 1921, I believe, which was the first year in which women were admitted to Augsburg College. And she looks at the story of Gerda Mortensen, both as it's told in the histories of Augsburg, the 100th anniversary and the 150th anniversary, but then she also went back and looked at Gerda Mortensen's own oral histories that she audio taped before she died. And she shows the distinction between the way the story is told by two men who wrote the 100th and 150th anniversary and the way she tells her own story in her own words. And it's really an interesting example of sometimes, where the power lies in history telling and sharing the story, and why. I mean, her point being, we need to listen to all the voices. We need to make sure these voices get heard. And so that's become an important thread throughout our Saga project on anything we look at. Who's telling us that story? Where are the voices of people who are actually involved? And one of the things we found is that Augsburg has quite remarkable archives. And we have a new digital archivist who's been digitizing many of those archives, and he's on the group. So he brings these amazing videotapes from the 1960s that he's digitized, and he brings them to the group to show us what somebody actually said back in 1967 or 1968 or whatever. So, that's a bit of what I think will happen next week. And that's in broad strokes. That's kind of what they focused on in the Saga group.
Okay. Well, I think we're at our end of our time. I hope our viewers, our participants got their questions answered. If not, as often, we can begin the next session. If there are questions that people want to send to me at fortin@augsburg.edu, I'll be sure that we tend to those, because sometimes we walk away from Zooms like this, the virtual times, and we come up with other questions. So by way of thanks to Paul, we can raise our hands and clap or whatever that we can do. And thanks again, Paul, for kicking off this 4-part session for this on our historical heritage, interrogating our sagas as we seek to live faithfully in the time being. So thank you so much, everyone, and particularly to you, Paul. Take care.
Appreciate it. Yeah.